She stepped off that stagecoach into a blizzard so fierce she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. 2,000 miles from Boston. No money, no family, no way back. And somewhere in that wall of white stood a man she had never met, the stranger she was about to marry. Grace Anderson had exactly two choices back home: work herself to death in a factory, or marry a 60-year-old man with wandering hands and a cruel reputation. So she did the unthinkable. She answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride and gambled her entire future on 3 letters from a man named Owen Ellis. But here's what Grace didn't know. Owen was carrying a secret so heavy it had driven him halfway across the country just to escape it. He had already buried a wife, he had already buried a daughter, and he had already buried his heart. What happens when two broken people, both running from their past, collide in the middle of a Montana snowstorm? Can love really grow from desperation? Can two strangers build a life worth living when neither one of them believes in happiness anymore? Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the greatest rewards. Faith isn't about knowing what comes next. It's about taking that first step anyway. This story reminds us that love isn't a feeling you stumble into. It's a choice you make every single day. And sometimes the person you've been waiting for your whole life is waiting for you too. You just have to be brave enough to meet them halfway. If you believe in second chances and the power of choosing love, drop a comment telling me, would you ever take a leap of faith like Grace did? And if this story touches your heart today, that like button and subscribe are the best ways to let me know you want more stories just like this one. The stagecoach bucked to a halt right in front of the general store. The sudden stop almost sent Grace Anderson sprawling from her seat. Snow tore through the tiny Montana town of Hecla, a blizzard so fierce it could make a grown man beg for mercy. Grace held her travel bag close, staring out the frosted glass at a wall of white that hid everything. She had come 2,000 miles from Boston, all to marry a man she'd never laid eyes on. Now, the last few moments before they met were trapped in this frozen storm. The driver yelled something, but the wind snatched the words away. She knew what it meant, though. This was it. Her fingers shook as she secured the last button on her wool coat. The coat felt warm enough back in Massachusetts, but here in the Montana Territory, in January of 1878, it might as well have been made of paper. She took a deep breath to steady her nerves and pushed. The heavy door opened, stepping right into snow up to her knees. The wind slammed into her, stealing the air from her lungs and ripping her bonnet off her head. Just before she tumbled, a pair of strong hands grabbed her elbow to steady her. "Miss Anderson." The voice was low and solid, and it cut right through the howl of the wind. Grace looked up into a face shaped by the outdoors, with eyes the color of a clear blue sky that looked so bright against his tanned skin. Snow was already piling up on his hat and the shoulders of his thick coat. He stood taller than she had pictured, and broader, too. He had a solid way about him that made the whole world feel a little less frightening. "I am Grace Anderson," she said, her teeth already starting to chatter. "Owen Ellis." He gave a small nod, touching the brim of his hat. "I have been out here in the cold waiting for you," the way he said it was not an accusation, but more like a simple fact, a quiet statement of what he was willing to do. His hand stayed on her elbow, a firm anchor against the storm. "I am so terribly sorry," Grace began. "The train had a problem in Chicago, and then there was another delay. Let us get inside before you turn to ice." Owen picked up her travel bag with one hand and kept his other arm securely around her. "We can talk in the warmth." He led her away from the general store and toward a small building next to it. It was a simple place, with a golden lamplight glowing in its windows. Grace fought her way through the snow, her dress getting heavier with every single step. By the time Owen finally pushed the door open, she had lost all feeling in her feet. The heat that rolled out to meet her felt like a miracle. A pot-bellied stove in the corner pumped warmth into a room that looked like an office and a home all in one. A desk by the window was covered in papers, and a simple bed was pushed against the far wall. The whole place was tidy and put together in a distinctly male way. "Sit down right here." Owen guided a chair much closer to the stove. "I will get some coffee started." Grace collapsed into the chair, feeling as if her legs could not hold her for another second. She watched Owen move around the room with an easy confidence. He stoked the fire, filled a dented coffee pot from a water pitcher, and measured out the grounds like he had done it 1,000 times before. Every move he made was smooth and efficient, the way a man who is used to fending for himself operates. "You are the sheriff," Grace realized, finally seeing the small star pinned to his vest under his coat. "Town marshal," Owen corrected her gently. "It is not exactly the same, but the work is similar. Did I forget to mention that in my letters?" They did mention it. Grace felt a flush of warmth on her cheeks that was not from the stove. "I do apologize. I am not normally this flustered. The trip was just much harder than I was expecting." Owen took his coat off and hung it on a hook, and finally turned to look at her directly. He was younger than she had guessed, maybe 28 or 29 years old, with dark brown hair that had a slight curl to it. He had a rugged kind of handsomeness, with a strong jawline, but his eyes were what truly held her gaze. They were filled with a quiet kindness that made a knot of tension in her chest begin to loosen. "There is no need for apologies." He poured hot coffee into 2 tin cups and passed one to her. "You traveled a very long way. That requires a great deal of courage." Grace held the warm cup with both hands, trying to soak up its heat, or a great deal of desperation. The words just came out before she could stop them, and she bit her lip, wishing she could pull them back. Owen only gave a slow nod, easing into the chair across from her. "I reckon we are both a little desperate in our own ways," he said softly. If we were not, we would not be sitting here right now. His honesty was a complete surprise. In all his letters, Owen had been polite but distant. He wrote about practical things like his job and his house, but never revealed anything personal. This open admission of their shared, strange situation felt like an unexpected connection. "I need to be truthful with you," Grace said, placing her cup down on the small table. "I may not be exactly the person you were expecting. None of us ever are." Owen leaned back, watching her with those calm blue eyes. "I was not looking for perfection, Miss Anderson. I was just hoping for a partner. Please, call me Grace." Grace. He said her name as if he were testing the sound of it. "And you had better call me Owen." Outside, the wind screamed and threw itself against the window panes. Grace glanced at the door, thinking of that blinding sheet of snow. "Do you think we can make it to the church this evening?" Owen looked toward the window and shook his head. "Reverend Miller is 3 miles outside of town. We would freeze solid before we got halfway there. This storm blew in much worse than anyone predicted." He paused for a moment, then spoke carefully. "I have already arranged a room for you at the boarding house just 2 doors down. You can spend the night there. I will sleep here in my office. We can figure out the wedding once this weather breaks." Grace felt a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. A part of her just wanted the wedding done with, to finally start her new life and leave all this uncertainty behind her. But another part of her was thankful for the delay, for a moment to breathe, before she tied her life to this man forever. "That is very thoughtful of you," she said. "It is the practical thing to do." Owen stood up and grabbed his coat from the hook. "We need to go now, though. The boarding house is not far, but this blizzard is getting meaner by the minute." He was not wrong. When Owen pulled the door open, the wind had become a monster, shooting snow sideways with a brutal force. Grace could not even see the building next to theirs. Owen took a scarf and wrapped it around her face, then took her arm again, holding her steady against the gale. The walk should have been 2 minutes long, but it felt like an eternity as they pushed through snowdrifts and fought to keep their footing. By the time Owen was banging his fist on the boarding house door, Grace was shaking from head to toe with ice forming on her eyelashes. A stout woman with streaks of silver in her hair swung the door open, her eyes going wide. "Good heavens, Owen, get in here!" They stumbled inside, and the woman slammed the door shut, sealing out the storm. "This must be the bride you're expecting. My name is Mrs. Patterson. I own this place. Grace Anderson. Grace said, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "You poor thing! You are frozen half to death!" Mrs. Patterson took control right away, helping Grace out of her wet coat and pointing her toward the stairs. "Owen, you bring her bag up to the room at the end of the hall. I will get this young lady warmed up and fed." Owen just nodded and headed back out, while Mrs. Patterson led Grace upstairs with a gentle but firm hand on her arm. The room was small, but it was perfectly clean. It had a proper bed with several quilts, a dresser, and a small washstand. A fire was already crackling away in a little fireplace. "Let us get you out of these damp clothes," Mrs. Patterson said, already working on the laces of Grace's boots. "You will catch a terrible chill." Grace's fingers were too numb to undo the buttons of her dress, so Mrs. Patterson helped her, making soft clicking sounds with her tongue as she felt the cold, wet fabric. She pulled a warm flannel nightgown from a drawer and helped Grace put it on. Then she wrapped her in a thick quilt and sat her in a chair close to the fire. "Is that better?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "So much better, thank you." Grace's voice was stronger now, but she was still trembling from the cold. A soft knock came at the door, and Owen came in carrying her travel bag, his gaze politely turned away. He set the bag on the floor and started to leave. "I will let you get some rest." "Wait," Grace said, standing up and holding the quilt tightly around herself. "Thank you, Owen, for all of this." He stopped in the doorway. When he turned back to look at her, a hint of warmth shone in his eyes. "I am just glad you arrived safely, Grace. We will have more time to talk tomorrow." After he was gone, Mrs. Patterson returned with a tray holding a bowl of hot stew and some bread. She watched with approval as Grace ate. "Owen is a good man," she said, taking the other chair. "He showed up here about 5 years ago and took the marshal job when no one else would. He has made this town a much safer place." "He certainly seems very capable," Grace replied carefully. "But he is lonely." Mrs. Patterson folded her hands in her lap. "He lost his whole family back in Kansas. I do not ask for details, but I know what grief looks like on a person. He has been carrying that weight all by himself for far too long." Grace took in this new piece of information. She thought about Owen's calm presence and his careful manners. She had been so wrapped up in her own reasons for becoming a mail-order bride, she hadn't really stopped to consider his reasons, beyond the purely practical. Now she found herself wondering what kind of sadness had pushed him to find a wife through letters, instead of courting a local woman. "I will do my best to be a good wife," Grace promised in a soft voice. Mrs. Patterson gave her hand a comforting pat. "I can tell you have seen your own share of trouble, dear. Maybe the two of you can help each other heal." After the older woman left, Grace sank into the soft bed, listening to the wind howl outside. It was her last night as a single woman, and likely her last night being known simply as Grace Anderson. If the weather cleared by tomorrow, she would become Mrs. Owen Ellis. She would tie her life, legally and spiritually, to a man she had only met a few hours before. Her mind drifted back to the life she'd left behind in Boston. Her father's passing 6 months prior had left her and her mother completely broke. They only found out after he was gone that his business had been failing for years, and that his debts had eaten up everything they ever owned. Her mother went to live with a sister in Philadelphia, but there was no room and no money for Grace to come along. Her options were grim. Either take a job in a factory or marry her father's old business partner, a man of 60 with hands that roamed and a reputation for cruelty. The advertisement for mail-order brides felt like a lifeline, a third choice that offered a chance to escape to somewhere new. Owen's letters had been honest and to the point. He needed a wife, a partner to share his life with in a small Montana town. He promised her respect, a partnership, and that he would be faithful. He never promised love, but Grace had learned a long time ago that love was a luxury, not something you need to survive. Even so, she thought about his hand, how it steadied her arm. She remembered the kindness in his eyes despite the biting cold, and how quietly he said he had been waiting for her. Maybe, just maybe, there were worse things to build a marriage on. The storm raged all through the night and continued the next day. Grace used the time to arrange her few belongings and chat with Mrs. Patterson, who turned out to know everything about Hika and the people in it. The town had sprung up around the silver mines in the mountains, though most of the easy silver was long gone now. About 200 people called the place home, a mix of miners, ranchers, and shopkeepers. Owen was the one who kept the peace, settling arguments and sometimes handling folks who tried to jump claims or thieves just passing through. "He is fair but firm," Mrs. Patterson explained as they sat in the warm parlor, watching the heavy snow fall outside. "Men respect that, and he is not afraid to face down trouble, even when it would be a whole lot easier to just look the other way." Grace got the feeling there was a story hiding behind that comment. But Mrs. Patterson did not say more, and Grace knew better than to push. She figured she would learn all about her new husband's life soon enough. Owen stopped by that evening, stamping the thick snow from his boots in the entryway. His cheeks were red from the cold, and a dusting of snow covered his shoulders. "Just wanted to make sure you are comfortable," he said, taking off his hat. "Very comfortable, thank you." Grace stood up from her chair in the parlor, feeling Mrs. Patterson's curious eyes on them. "Would you like to come sit by the fire and warm up?" Owen paused for a second, then gave a nod. He took the chair across from her, turning his hat over in his hands. A long moment of silence stretched between them, and Grace could feel the heavy weight of everything they still did not know about each other. "I ought to tell you more about what your life will be like here," Owen finally said. "I have a small house on the edge of town. It has 2 bedrooms, a main room that includes the kitchen and a root cellar. It is not anything fancy, but it is solid and it is warm. I have spent the last few months fixing it up." "I am sure it will be lovely," Grace said. "I am not looking for luxury. There is a schoolhouse if you were interested in teaching. I remember from your letters that you were a governess. Miss Harmon is teaching there now, but she's getting married to a rancher this spring. She would probably be grateful for the help even before then." A little bit of hope bloomed in Grace's chest. She had not let herself even dream that she might be able to work with children again. "I would like that very much." "Good." Owen seemed to relax just a little. "I thought you might. I know this is not easy, Grace. Marrying a stranger and moving to the middle of nowhere. I want you to know, I will do my best to be a good husband. I am not always going to be easy to live with. My work can be dangerous, and sometimes I get too wrapped up in it. But I will be faithful to you, and I will respect you, and I will work hard to provide for you." The genuine honesty in his voice made Grace's throat feel tight. "I appreciate you telling me that. I promise I will do my best to be a good wife. I know how to cook and keep a house, and I can manage the books. I will not complain about the hardships." "You are allowed to complain," Owen said, and a hint of a smile touched his eyes. "You are human, not a saint." This time, Grace really did smile. "Well, I will try to save my complaints for when things are truly awful." "Like February," Owen's lips quirked up. "It gets colder than January, if you can believe that." "I find that very hard to imagine." "You will see." He got to his feet, still turning his hat in his hands. "The storm should pass by tomorrow. I got a message to Reverend Miller. If you are still willing, we can be married tomorrow afternoon." Grace's heart started pounding against her ribs. "I am willing." Owen nodded slowly, his eyes searching her face. "No second thoughts?" She thought about Boston, about the awful life that was waiting for her if she went back. Then she thought about this solid, dependable man who had waited for her in the freezing cold, who spoke so honestly about his own shortcomings, and who had thought to ask if she might want to teach. "No second thoughts," she said, her voice firm. Something in Owen's expression changed, a tension easing away that Grace had not even noticed was there until it was gone. "Then I will see you tomorrow, Grace Anderson," he said, for the last time with that name. After he had gone, Mrs. Patterson came in with a knowing look and a satisfied smile. Well, that went nicely. Does anything happen in this house that you do not know about? Grace asked. But she was smiling too. Not much, Mrs. Patterson admitted with a cheerful tone. And I will tell you something else, dear. I have known Owen for 5 years now, and I have never once seen him look at anyone the way he just looked at you. You give this marriage a fair chance, and I think you both might find something truly good. Grace wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that this huge leap of faith might lead to something more than just simple survival. But life had taught her to be careful with hope, to guard her heart against disappointment. Still, as she lay in bed that night, she did not think about her fears. Instead, she thought about Owen's steady presence and his careful kindness and the warmth in his eyes when he had said her name. Maybe Mrs. Patterson was right. Maybe there really was a chance for something good here. The morning of her wedding day arrived clear and brutally cold. Grace woke up to bright sunshine pouring through her window, lighting up a world that had been turned into sparkling white crystal. The storm had left behind 3 feet of snow, carving huge drifts into strange and beautiful shapes against the buildings and fences. Mrs. Patterson helped her get dressed in her best gown, a deep green wool that highlighted the reddish tints in her brown hair. It was not a real wedding dress, but it was the nicest thing she owned, and she had protected it carefully on the long journey. You look beautiful, Mrs. Patterson said, pinning Grace's hair up neatly at the base of her neck. Owen will not be able to take his eyes off you. Grace looked at her reflection in the small mirror. At 24, she was not considered young for marriage, especially out here on the frontier where girls often married in their teens. Her face was a bit too angular to be called pretty in the usual way. Her mouth was too wide and her chin was too stubborn. But her eyes were a clear gray-green, smart and direct, and her hair had a certain richness to it when it was brushed out. I just hope I do not disappoint him, she said softly. You could not possibly. Mrs. Patterson squeezed her shoulders. Now, Owen sent a message saying he would come for you at noon. The Reverend is going to meet you both at the church. Grace's stomach was doing flips, but she just nodded. She had made her decision. Now it was time to see it through. Owen showed up at exactly noon. He was dressed in what was obviously his best suit, a dark wool that made his shoulders look even broader. He had trimmed his hair and shaved, showing the strong line of his jaw. When his eyes landed on Grace, he stopped right there in the doorway, and she saw them widen just a little. You look lovely, he said, his voice a bit husky. Thank you. You look quite handsome. A touch of red colored his cheeks, and Grace suddenly knew that Owen was just as nervous as she was. That simple fact made her feel a whole lot better. The walk to the church was a struggle through the thick snow, but Owen kept a firm hold on her arm, steadying her whenever she slipped. Other folks from town were outside shoveling their walkways, and they called out greetings. They stared with open curiosity as Owen and Grace walked by, and Grace could feel the weight of all those eyes on her. They mean well, Owen said in a low voice, but I know it must be uncomfortable. I suppose I will have to get used to it, Grace answered. Small towns are always like that. The church was a plain wooden building with a little steeple. It was simple but clean and looked after. Reverend Miller was waiting inside for them. He was a thin man with gray hair and kind eyes. Mrs. Patterson and her husband had come along, and so had the shopkeeper with his wife and a few other townspeople, including Miss Anderson. Reverend Miller greeted her with a warm smile. Welcome to Hecla. Owen has been waiting eagerly for you to arrive. Thank you, Reverend. I suppose we should begin? The Reverend moved to his spot in front of the simple altar, and Owen and Grace stood before him. Grace felt like time had stopped, and she was aware of every single detail. She could feel the cold air still clinging to the hem of her dress, smell the faint scent of wood smoke and pine trees, and feel the solid warmth of Owen standing so near to her. He reached for her hand, and his grip was steady, like an anchor. Reverend Miller's voice seemed to wash over her. He spoke the familiar words about love and devotion, about leaving all others behind and holding on to one another. Owen's answers came out strong and clear, and his eyes stayed locked on hers the entire time. When it was Grace's turn, she was surprised that her own voice came out so steady. I, Grace Anderson, take you, Owen Ellis, to be my lawfully wedded husband. Owen slid a plain gold ring onto her finger, and its weight felt heavy and real. This was actually happening. She was really marrying this man. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Miller said with a smile. Owen, you may kiss your bride. Owen gently lifted his hand to cup her cheek. His touch was warm and careful, and then his lips met hers. It was a short, respectful kiss, but Grace felt a promise in it, the start of something that might just grow into more. When he pulled back, the small crowd clapped, and Mrs. Patterson was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, crying happy tears. Grace felt a little dizzy, her lips still tingling from his touch. Mrs. Ellis, Owen said softly, and his voice was filled with wonder, as if he could hardly believe it was real. Mr. Ellis, Grace said back, trying out the sound of her new name. They signed the official marriage book, and then the little group headed back outside into the bright sunshine. Mrs. Patterson gave Grace a tight hug. Now you come to me if you need anything, you hear? I will. Thank you for everything. Owen shook hands with the other men, accepting their congratulations and what was probably some rough advice that Grace was glad she could not quite make out. Then he offered her his arm again, and they started walking through the snow to the place that was now her home. The house stood on the east side of town. It was a humble home made of logs and planks, with a shingled roof and a covered front porch. Smoke was curling up from the chimney, and the windows shone with what looked like brand-new glass. I know it is not much, Owen said as they got closer. It looks perfect, Grace told him, and she meant it. Compared to the tiny apartment she and her mother had to live in after her father's debts came to light, this house was a palace. Owen opened the front door, and then he did something that surprised her. He scooped her right up into his arms. She let out a small gasp and grabbed onto his shoulders to keep her balance. It is tradition, he said, and a small smile touched his lips as he carried her inside. The house was warm and, to her surprise, very well furnished. The main room had a solid table and chairs, a sofa set near the fireplace, and shelves filled with books. The kitchen corner had a good stove, cupboards, and a dry sink. Everything was spotless and tidy. You have been busy, Grace said after Owen set her gently on her feet. I wanted everything to be ready for you. He pointed toward a door on the right. That is the bedroom. I put your bag in there already. The other room is smaller. I have been using it, but if you want that one, I can move. Owen. Grace touched his arm, cutting off his stream of words. This is our home now. We should share the bedroom. He looked down at her, studying her face. I do not want to rush you, Grace. I know this is all happening so fast. If you need time... We are married, Grace said softly. I understand what that means. Owen gave a slow nod. I will be patient. I want to make this as easy for you as I can. His thoughtfulness truly touched her. She had known men who would have just demanded their rights as a husband without a single thought for her own comfort or feelings. Owen's kindness, his offer to give her space even now, said a lot about the kind of man he was. I appreciate that, she told him. But you do not have to handle me like I am made of glass. I am tougher than I look. This time a real smile spread across Owen's face. I am starting to see that. They spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, finding their way through a clumsy new life together. Grace took a better look around the house and found a root cellar stocked with potatoes, carrots, onions, and apples. The bedroom had a big bed with a beautiful quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a chair near the window. Her travel bag looked small and out of place on the large bed, and her few belongings seemed lost in the room. She unpacked her things one by one, placing her other dress and her nightgown in the dresser. She set out her brush and mirror and hung her mother's cameo on a nail beside it. They were small things, but they were her way of making this space her own. When she came back out, Owen was tending to the fire with practiced ease. "Are you hungry? I have some venison stew on. I am not much of a cook, I am afraid, but I can manage a few simple meals." "I am happy to do the cooking," Grace offered. "That was part of our agreement." "Not today," Owen said, standing up straight. "Today you need to rest. It has been a long journey and a very eventful couple of days." Grace wanted to protest, but a sudden wave of exhaustion washed over her. The trip, the worry, the wedding, it all hit her at once. "Perhaps you are right." They ate Owen's stew, which was much tastier than he let on, and had some bread from the general store. Their conversation was careful. They avoided the big topics, sticking to safe things like the weather and the town. As the sun went down, Grace could feel the tension building in the quiet room. Bedtime was getting closer. At last, Owen got up and began to bank the fire for the night. "It is getting late." Grace's heart started to pound in her chest. "Yes." Owen turned and looked at her. "Grace, I meant every word I said earlier. I will not push you into anything. We can just sleep. There is no hurry." A part of Grace wanted to take his offer, to put off the moment of intimacy with this man who was still a stranger. But another part of her knew that waiting would only make it harder, would only make her more anxious. It was better to just go forward and start building whatever their marriage was going to be. "I am your wife," she said in a quiet voice. "I understand my duties." Owen closed the distance between them in 3 long steps. He placed his hands on her shoulders. His touch was gentle but firm. "Grace, look at me." She lifted her gaze to his and saw a seriousness there that took her breath away. "This is not a duty," he said, his voice low and deep. "At least I hope it will not always feel like one. I will not pretend that I do not want you, but I want you to be willing, not just accepting. Can you understand that difference?" Grace felt a change deep inside her chest. In all the time she had worried about this moment, she had never imagined this. She had braced herself for a demand, maybe some roughness hidden behind a thin layer of politeness. She never, ever expected him to care if she was willing, if she actually felt any desire. "I am willing," she said, and was surprised to find that it was the truth. "I am nervous, but I am willing." Owen's thumb gently brushed along her jaw, a touch as light as a feather. "I will be gentle," he promised. "I promise." He lowered his head slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull back, and then he kissed her. This kiss was deeper than the one at the church, more questioning. Grace's hands came up to rest on his chest, and she could feel the hard muscle under his shirt, the steady thump of his heart. A warmth spread through her. It was a new feeling, but it was not a bad one. Owen drew back just a little, his breathing a bit shaky. "Come to bed." In the bedroom, with only the moonlight shining on the snow outside to light the room, they undressed with clumsy fingers. Owen turned his back to give Grace some privacy, a kindness she was grateful for, as she struggled out of her dress and into her nightgown. When she slid between the cold sheets, Owen got in beside her. She could feel the heat from his body, even though they were not yet touching. He turned onto his side to face her and found her hand under the blankets. "I am glad you came, Grace. I am so glad you are here." "I am glad, too," Grace whispered, and she truly meant it. What happened next was hesitant and gentle. It was awkward at times, but it was never rough. Owen kept his word, always moving slowly, always checking to see if she was all right. Grace felt exposed, but not in danger. She felt unsure, but not afraid. When it was finished, Owen pulled her close, stroking her hair as he held her. Grace felt tears well up in her eyes, but she could not have said why. "Are you all right?" Owen asked, and his voice was full of concern. "Yes," Grace managed to say. I did not expect kindness." Owen's arms tightened around her. "What kind of men have you known?" "Not many," Grace admitted. "But the ones I did know were not very kind. Then they were fools, Owen said, and he kissed the top of her head. Sleep now. You are safe here. Grace closed her eyes, resting her head against him, and for the first time in a very long time she believed it, on Owen's chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart under her ear. She was married, in a bed with a man she hardly knew, in a town 2,000 miles from anything she had ever called home. But for the first time in a very long time, she felt a quiet, fragile sense of peace. The days that came after started to fall into their own rhythm. Grace would get up early to make breakfast, learning the little quirks of the wood stove and figuring out how to make do with their limited pantry. Owen ate whatever she put in front of him without a single complaint, even the time she got the heat wrong and burned the biscuits. He would leave every morning to make his rounds through the town, checking on the business owners, settling a small argument here and there, and making sure everything stayed peaceful. Grace spent those first few days really exploring Hika. The town was small enough that you could walk from one end to the other in 20 minutes. It had one main street with all the shops and two side streets lined with houses. There was a general store that was run by a quiet man who did not talk much, named Mr. Hayes, and his cheerful wife, Martha. They ran a saloon that seemed respectable enough, at least while the sun was up. The town also had a blacksmith, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and the schoolhouse. Miss Harmon turned out to be a young woman of 20 with blonde hair and a smile that could warm a winter morning. "Oh, I am just so happy to meet you," she said, her voice full of genuine relief when Grace introduced herself. "Owen mentioned you had some experience teaching. Would you truly be interested in helping out?" "I would like that very much," Grace replied. "That is wonderful. I have 18 students, and they range from 6 to 14 years old. It is quite a challenge trying to manage all those different learning levels. If you could work with the younger children while I focus on the older ones, it would be a world of help." They decided Grace would start helping out 3 days a week, and Grace felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She would have something of her own here, a purpose that went beyond just being Owen's wife. She also started getting to know the other women in town. Mrs. Patterson took her around and made introductions. While a few of the women were a bit reserved, most of them were welcoming. They were mighty curious about her, about Boston, and about how on earth she came to marry a man like Owen. Grace answered all their questions with care, sharing only the parts that felt safe. The evenings, though, became her favorite part of the day. Owen would come home right as the light began to fade, stomping the fresh snow from his boots and bringing the crisp smell of the cold outdoors in with him. Grace always had dinner ready, and they would sit together at their small table, just talking about how their days went. Owen told her all about the folks in town, sharing their stories and their little quirks. In turn, Grace shared tales about the children at the school, or about her talks with Martha Hayes or Mrs. Patterson. At night, they shared the big bed, and slowly the closeness between them felt less awkward and much more natural. Owen was a considerate man, learning what Grace enjoyed, and always making sure she found pleasure in their time together. Grace soon found herself truly looking forward to those quiet hours in the darkness, when Owen's hands and his lips made her feel things she never knew she was capable of feeling. About 3 weeks after they were married, a warm spell rolled through. It melted some of the snow and turned all the streets into a sea of mud. Owen came home one evening with a thundercloud on his brow, and Grace felt a little flicker of worry. "What is the matter?" she asked, setting their dinner on the table. Owen pulled off his heavy coat and hung it up with care. "We have had a string of thefts, some tools from the blacksmith, supplies from the general store, food from the boarding house. They are all small things, but it is happening consistently. I have my suspicions about who is responsible." Owen sat down with a heavy sigh. "There is a group of miners who lost their jobs when the Silver Bell mine shut down last month. They are having a real hard time running out of money. I reckon some of them are stealing just to get by." "That is understandable, is it not?" Grace said softly. "If they are truly desperate." "Understandable, yes, but it is still against the law." Owen rubbed his face, looking tired down to the bone. "I have a job to do, Grace. I have to enforce the law, even when I feel for the folks who are breaking it." Grace heard the heavy strain in his voice, and she understood completely. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to find a way that does not involve putting starving men behind bars," Owen said, looking up at her. "But I will be honest, I do not know what that way is just yet." For the next few days, Owen worked from sunup to sundown, meeting with the mine owners, the local merchants, and the mayor. Grace watched him get more and more wound up, the worry lines around his eyes carving themselves deeper. She wished to goodness she could help but had no idea how. Then one evening, a thought sparked in her mind. She found Owen in his small office, buried under a mountain of paperwork. "What if the town merchants agreed to hire on the miners for odd jobs?" she offered. "Things like repairs, hauling supplies, whatever needs to be done. It would give the miners some income and fix the whole problem without anyone seeing the inside of a jail cell." Owen just looked at her, his expression a mix of surprise and pure admiration. "That might just work," he said slowly. "And maybe the church could help organize some donations, like food and supplies. It would not be charity, just a community pulling together to get through a rough patch." "Grace Ellis, you are a marvel." Owen got to his feet and pulled her into his arms, giving her a firm and thankful kiss. "I will go see the merchants tomorrow, and then I will talk with Reverend Miller." His plan, built right on Grace's good sense, worked far better than anyone dared to hope. The merchants were willing to give it a try. The church gathered donations, and just like that, the stealing stopped. The miners were so grateful for the chance to earn an honest dollar that they became a real asset to the town. In fact, several of them ended up getting hired on for permanent work. After that, Owen's respect for Grace seemed to grow a country mile. She would often catch him just watching her with a kind of warmth that made her own heart do a little flip. He started asking for her opinion on other matters, treating her like a real partner and not just a wife he was meant to provide for. Grace found herself falling for him, plain and simple, without even noticing it was happening. It was always in the little things. It was the way Owen always made sure the house was warm before she got out of bed, or how he would bring her wildflowers when the first spring blooms appeared in sheltered places. It was in the careful way he listened when she talked, as if her words were the most important thing in the world to him. One evening in late March, as they sat together on the sofa near the fire, Grace leaned her head on Owen's shoulder. She felt a wave of contentment so strong it nearly scared her. "I am happy," she said, surprised at herself for saying the thought out loud. Owen's arm wrapped around her, pulling her in a little closer. "So am I." "I did not expect this," Grace went on. "When I agreed to come out here, I was just hoping for safety, for a secure life. I never expected to actually be happy." "Neither did I." Owen's voice was quiet. "After I lost my family, I did not think I would ever feel this way again." Grace turned her head to look up at him. "You have never told me what happened." Owen was silent for a long moment, and Grace thought he might not answer her. Then he took a deep breath. "I had a wife and a daughter back in Kansas. Their names were Sarah and Emma. My Emma was 3 years old. She was all curls and laughter. And Sarah, she was the kindest woman I ever knew." The past tense of his words hit Grace like a physical blow. "What happened to them?" "Cholera. It swept through our town one summer. They were both gone within a week of each other. I could not save them. There was nothing I could do but watch them suffer." Owen's voice was flat, empty of all emotion, but Grace could feel the old, raw pain coming off of him. "After they were buried, I just could not stay there. Every single thing reminded me of them. So I came out here to start over. I figured I would just exist, you know? Do my job. Get through the days. I never expected to feel anything real again." "Oh, Owen." Grace turned all the way around, taking his face in her hands. She saw the grief in his eyes, old but still there, and her heart just broke for him. "I am so sorry." "I need you to know that I do not see you as a replacement," Owen said, his voice urgent. "You are not Sarah. What we have is different, but it is real. My feelings for you are real, Grace, and they run deep." "I know," Grace answered, kissing him softly. My feelings for you run deep as well. That night when they came together, there was a tenderness between them that went far beyond physical want. Grace felt as though they were truly connected, not just in their bodies, but in their souls. Later, as they lay wrapped in each other's arms in the quiet darkness, she whispered, "I love you." She felt Owen freeze in her arms. Then his hold on her tightened, almost to the point of pain. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I would say those words to another soul, but I mean them. I love you, Grace." Tears slid down Grace's cheeks, but they were tears of pure joy. She never imagined she would find love in a marriage that had been arranged for her. All she had hoped for was a little security and some respect. But here, in this little Montana town with this steady and gentle man, she had discovered something so much more precious. Spring made its way slowly to Hecla, with the snow melting away in fits and starts. It revealed a countryside that was surprisingly beautiful. Grace found herself falling in love with the mountains that stood to the west, their peaks still covered in snow, even while wildflowers began to bloom in the valleys below. She loved the enormous sky that seemed to stretch on forever, a world away from the cramped streets of Boston. Her duties at the school grew after Miss Harmon married a local rancher in April and moved to his property 20 miles away. Grace took over all the teaching responsibilities. She adored the work and cherished watching the children's faces brighten when they finally understood something new. Owen built new shelves for the schoolhouse and fixed the broken windows. Grace felt a wave of pride as she watched him work. Their life together found a comfortable rhythm. They had their disagreements, of course. Grace worried that Owen took too many chances in his job as the town marshal. Owen felt that Grace wore herself out, teaching all day only to come home to cook and clean. But they learned to talk through their differences, to find middle ground, and to see things from the other's point of view. In May, Grace noticed her monthly visitor had not arrived. She waited 1 week and then another, not wanting to get her hopes up until she was absolutely sure. But when the signs became impossible to ignore, she knew it was time to tell Owen. She picked a peaceful evening when Owen was unwinding, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. "Owen, I need to tell you something." He turned to her, his attention entirely on her. "What is it?" "I'm going to have a baby." Owen's eyes went wide, his expression shifting from shock to wonder, and then to pure joy so fast it almost made Grace laugh. "Are you sure?" "Truly. I believe I'm about 2 months along." Owen got up and pulled her to her feet, wrapping her up in a big hug. "Grace, this is the most wonderful news. Are you happy?" "I am," she said, and she was surprised to find it was the honest truth. 6 months ago, the idea of having a child would have filled her with fear. But now, with Owen by her side in their home, she felt nothing but happiness and excitement. "Are you?" "More than I can put into words." Owen stepped back to look at her, placing his hand gently on her belly, which was still flat. A baby. Our baby. But then Grace saw a shadow of worry cross his face, and she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Owen, this baby is ours. It will be different this time, I know." But she felt his hand tremble just a little. "I just cannot stand the thought of losing someone I love again." Grace placed her hand over his. "We will be careful. Doc Brennan is a good doctor. I am young and strong. You will not lose me. I am far too stubborn for that." Owen managed a small smile at her words. "Yes, you certainly are." In the months that followed, as Grace's belly grew round with their child, Owen's protectiveness became almost comical. He did not want her to lift a single heavy thing. He did not want her to walk too far. He worried about her health constantly. Grace found it both sweet and frustrating. "I am pregnant, not made of delicate glass," she told him one day in August, when he tried to take a basket of laundry from her. "I know, I am sorry. I am just so scared," he admitted. Grace's expression softened. I understand, but you have to trust me, and you have to trust that we are going to be all right. Owen did his best. Grace could see how much effort it took, but he tried. He still hovered nearby, but he learned to step back when she told him she was fine. And Grace learned to see when his worry was getting the best of him, when he needed to hear her say that she was healthy and safe. The women of the town gathered around Grace as her time drew near. They held a small party for her, bringing gifts for the baby, like tiny clothes, soft blankets, and handmade rattles. Mrs. Patterson had knitted a lovely blanket in shades of blue and yellow. Martha Hayes brought a wooden cradle that her husband had carved by hand. Grace was overwhelmed by the kindness of these women, who had been complete strangers to her just a few months before. "You are one of us now, Mrs." Patterson said, giving her a warm hug. "We look after our own here." In late October, just as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift down, Grace felt the first twinge of labor. She was at the schoolhouse sending the children home for the day when the contraction hit her. She grabbed the edge of her desk, breathing through the pain, and as soon as it passed, she sent one of the older boys to go get Owen. He came at a dead run, his face white with worry. "Is it time?" "I believe so." Grace tried to give him a reassuring smile, but another contraction gripped her, and this one was much stronger. Owen helped her get home and then sent for Doc Brennan and Mrs. Patterson. He paced nervously while Mrs. Patterson took control, helping Grace get into bed and examining her. She declared that everything seemed to be progressing normally. "This is going to take some time," Mrs. Patterson said calmly. "First, babies often do. Owen, you ought to wait in the other room. I want to stay," Owen insisted. "Owen," Grace began, "please." He took her hand in his. "I need to be here with you." Grace looked at his face and saw the fear in his eyes, the memory of losing his first wife and child. She squeezed his hand tightly. "Stay." It was a very long labor. Doc Brennan came to check on Grace from time to time, always saying that things were normal, just slow. Mrs. Patterson did her best to keep Grace comfortable, wiping her brow with cool cloths and helping her walk around the room when moving seemed to ease the pain. And Owen never left her side. He held her hand, whispered words of encouragement, his own face a mask of concern. As the hours dragged on and the pain grew more intense, Grace started to understand Owen's deep-seated fear. This was hard, much harder than she had ever imagined, and there was no way to stop it. But she focused on Owen's face, on his steady presence beside her, and that helped her keep going. Finally, just as the morning light started to paint the sky, Doc Brennan announced, "It is time to push." The next few minutes were a blur of intense effort, pain, and encouragement. Then, all at once, there was a feeling of release, and the sharp cry of a newborn baby filled the room. "A boy," Doc Brennan said, holding up a red-faced, wailing infant. "Healthy boy." He gently placed the baby in Grace's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face. Her son. Their son. Tears of joy streamed down her cheeks. "Owen," she whispered. Owen was crying too, without any shame, his hand shaking as he reached out to touch the baby's head. "He is perfect. You are perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you." They named him Oliver, after Owen's father. He was a good baby, mostly calm and content, and Grace recovered from the birth without any trouble. Owen was completely smitten with his son. He would spend hours just watching him sleep, holding him close, and talking to him in a soft voice that Grace had never heard him use before. "I never believed I would have this again," Owen told her one night as they lay in bed with Oliver sleeping in his cradle next to them. "I thought that part of my life was gone forever. But you gave it all back to me. You gave me a family again." Grace turned to face him. "We gave each other a family. I had nothing when I first came here, Owen. I was just running from a life I could no longer stand. You gave me a home, safety, respect, and love. So much love." Owen kissed her gently. "I still have a hard time believing you are really mine." "I am yours," Grace confirmed. And you are mine. Always. Their first winter with Oliver was a challenge, but it was also filled with joy. Grace decided not to go back to teaching, choosing instead to focus on taking care of their son. She did not mind at all. The school board hired a new teacher, a young man from Denver, and Grace was happy to be at home. As Oliver grew, his little personality started to show. He was a cheerful baby, quick to smile, and curious about everything he saw. He had Owen's blue eyes and Grace's dark hair, a beautiful combination. In the spring, when Oliver was 6 months old, Grace found out she was pregnant again. Owen was overjoyed, though Grace could see that familiar worry creep back into his eyes. But this pregnancy was easier than her first, and she carried their second child with a sense of confidence. Their second son, Oscar, was born in December, arriving much more quickly and easily than Oliver had. His entrance into the world. He was a louder baby than his brother and more demanding, but he was loved just as much. 2 sons. Grace would watch Owen with their boys and feel her heart swell with so much love it felt like it would burst. He was a wonderful father, always patient and playful. He taught them as they grew, supported them when they stumbled, and celebrated all their little victories. The years went by in a happy haze of ordinary days that Grace cherished. First steps and first words, scraped knees and childhood fevers, school pageants and fishing trips. Owen stayed on as the Marshal of Hecla, a man the whole community respected and relied upon. Grace went back to teaching part-time after the boys were a little older. She still loved the work, but she always made sure that her family came first. They faced their share of hardships, of course. The winters could be terribly harsh. There were times when money was tight. One year, Owen broke his leg badly while dealing with a horse thief, and Grace took care of him for months while he recovered. Oscar came down with pneumonia at age 5 and Model. They spent terrifying days wondering if they were going to lose him. But he pulled through. And through all of it, their love for each other grew deeper and stronger. The fiery passion of their early love settled into something much steadier, but it was no less powerful. They knew each other's faults and loved each other anyway, or maybe even because of them. They learned to work like a team, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating together in the good ones. On their 10th anniversary, Owen took Grace back to the very spot where she had arrived on that snowy January day. It was summertime now, warm and bright, and the town was prosperous and growing. "Do you ever regret it?" Owen asked her. "Coming all the way out here, marrying a complete stranger?" Grace looked at him, at the man who had become the very center of her world. His hair had touches of gray now, and the lines around his eyes were a little deeper. But he was still solid, still steady. He was still the man who had waited in the cold for her. "Never," she said with no doubt in her voice. "It was the best choice I ever made." Owen drew her in tight. "I love you, Grace Ellis. I reckon I have loved you since you first stepped off that stagecoach, even if I was too bullheaded to see it then. I love you too, and I always will." They just stood there in the warm sun, gazing at the house where they had watched their boys play, where their whole life together had taken root and grown. Grace remembered the frightened woman she used to be, running from a life she just could not bear, praying just to make it through another day. But she had found a whole lot more than that. She had found a real home. She had found a deep love. She had finally found out who she was meant to be. The years kept rolling on by, each one bringing its own set of troubles and joys. Oliver became a quiet, serious fellow who was always lost in a book. He ended up going to Helena to study law. Oscar, well, he was the wild one, restless just like his daddy had been at that age, working as a ranch hand and always talking about seeing what else was out there in the territory. Through it all, Grace and Owen faced everything side by side. When Owen finally hung up his marshal's badge for good at 55, he started up a little cattle ranch just outside of town. Grace kept on teaching until she was in her late 50s, helping the new teachers get their start and seeing whole generations of kids grow up in her schoolhouse. They got old with each other, their hair turning to silver, and their walk getting a little slower, but their hands would always find one another in the dark of night. Then came the grandkids. There was Oliver's girl, Emma, named after Owen's very first child, and then Oscar's twin boys. Grace would hold those little ones and just be amazed at how their love kept on going, passed down to the next family line. One peaceful fall evening, they were sitting on their porch, watching the sun dip behind the mountains they had looked at for 40 years. Owen reached for Grace's hand. "You know, I have been thinking," he said, "about that first day you got here. That blizzard, the bitter cold, and the scared look on your face when you got down from that stage." "I was scared to death," Grace confessed. "I did not have a single clue what was coming next." "I have been waiting in the cold for you," Owen said, remembering the first words he ever spoke to her. "Back then, I just meant I was standing out in the snow. But now, looking back, I reckon I had been waiting for you a whole lot longer than that. Just waiting for somebody to bring some sunshine back into my world." Grace felt that familiar prickle of tears in her eyes. Even after all this time, his words could still get to her. "And you were waiting for me too, even if we did not know it. I was just looking for a safe place to land. Instead, I got everything I could have ever wanted." "We sure got lucky," Owen said in a low voice. "We were blessed," Grace corrected him gently. They sat there quiet and easy as the night settled in around them. They were just two folks who had started out as strangers and somehow built a life full of love and purpose. Grace thought on all the years that had passed, all the big moments and the little everyday things that had been stitched together to make up their life story. She had shown up in a snowstorm, lost and afraid, and Owen had been waiting in the cold for her, feeling lonely and unsure himself. But between the two of them, they made a warmth that could chase away any chill, a light that could cut through any darkness. They built a family, a home, and a love that had stood the test of time. As the first stars started to pop out in the darkening sky, Grace laid her head on Owen's shoulder and his arm wrapped right around her without a second thought. This right here was home. This was love. This was right where she was supposed to be all along. And she could not remember ever feeling this happy. Years on, Oliver came back home with his own family for Christmas and found his folks sitting right there on the porch. They were all bundled up in blankets, watching the snow come down easy over the mountains, not minding the cold one bit. "You two are going to freeze out here," he teased them softly. Owen and Grace just shared a look, and a little smile played on her lips. "We have sat through plenty of cold nights together. The cold does not scare us anymore." Oliver just shook his head with a grin. He had spent his whole life watching his folks love, and he knew that what they had was something special, something you do not find every day. He sure hoped he could build a life like that with his own wife. Inside, the house was warm and full of light, alive with the sound of grandkids playing, Oscar giving his brother a hard time just for fun, and the smell of supper cooking on the stove. This was the world Grace and Owen had made. It was more than just a house and a family. It was a whole life built on love. Later on that night, when the house was quiet and everyone else was asleep, Grace and Owen were lying together in the dark. It was the same bed they had shared for 45 years, even if the mattress had been swapped out a time or two. The house itself had grown and been fixed up over the years, but at its heart, it was still that same little place where they had started out. "Are you happy, Grace?" Owen's voice was just a whisper in the quiet room. "Every single day," Grace said, and she meant it. She meant, "Are you?" "More than I ever knew a man could be," he said. His hand found hers under all the warm quilts. "I was waiting out in the cold for you, and you were the one who brought me back to the land of the living. You gave me more than a man like me ever had a right to ask for." "We gave each other what we both needed," Grace said. "That was the wonder of it all. We were both a little broken, each in our own way, and we managed to put each other back together." "I love you," Owen whispered. "I love you too. Always have, always will." They fell asleep just like that, still holding hands. They were just two people who took a wild gamble on a stranger and ended up finding exactly what they had been looking for their whole lives. Outside, the snow kept coming down, soft and quiet, covering the little town of Hecla in a blanket of white. It looked just like it did on the day Grace first showed up so long ago. But this time there was no fear, no doubt in the air. There was just a deep-down peace, a quiet happiness, and a love that had been through every kind of storm and had only gotten stronger because of it. The next morning came clear and bright with the sun making the new snow sparkle. Grace woke up before Owen like she usually did and just laid there watching him sleep. His face had deep lines now and his hair was white as snow, but she could still see the man who had stood waiting for her in the freezing cold. The one who had been so patient and good to her when he could have been angry. The man who had loved her with a strength and loyalty that never wavered. She remembered writing a letter to her mother all those years back, trying her best to describe this new life and explain how she had found so much joy in a place she never expected. Her mother had come to visit 2 times before she passed on, so she got to see with her own eyes what Grace and Owen had made together. "You picked a good one," her mother had told her on that second trip, watching Owen showing little Oliver how to handle a horse. "A better man than I ever could have picked out for you." And Grace knew it was true. She had chosen well, even if back then it felt more like she was just running scared. But maybe that is all faith really is. Just taking a step into the dark and trusting that things will find a way to work out. Owen moved next to her and his eyes fluttered open. He smiled when he saw her looking at him. "Morning, my love." "Good morning." Grace leaned in and gave him a soft kiss. "What has got you looking so serious?" Owen asked, his hand coming up to brush a silver piece of hair from her face. "Just thinking about how far we have come, and how thankful I am for all of it." "No, I am the one who is thankful," Owen said. "You are the one who took a gamble on me. Came all this way out here to build a life with a man you had never met." "You took a gamble, too," Grace reminded him. "You could have gotten anyone. Someone selfish or mean or just not the right fit at all. But I got you," Owen said, and he pulled her in. "I got the perfect one." "Oh, I am a long way from perfect." "You are perfect for me," Owen corrected her. From down the hall, they could hear the rest of the house starting to wake up. The grandkids were laughing, and they could hear Oscar calling out for his boys. It was the sound of family on Christmas morning. "We probably ought to get up," Grace said, though she did not want to. "Just one more minute," Owen pleaded, holding her even tighter. "Let me just hold my wife for one more minute before all the commotion starts." Grace settled back down into his arms, feeling completely at peace. This was more than she ever could have imagined for herself back in those terrible days in Boston. This feeling of warmth, of being loved, of knowing you belong right here with another person. "I would go through it all again," she said, the words coming out of nowhere. "Every tough time, every single struggle. I would do it all over again just to get right back here." "Me too," Owen said right away. "Every last bit of it, the good and the bad, it all brought us to this. I would not change a thing." At last they got up and dressed and went to join the family in the main room. Oliver had a good fire roaring in the fireplace, and Oscar was in the kitchen helping his mother-in-law with breakfast. The grandkids were crowded around the tree, shaking the little presents, even though they knew they had to wait until after they ate to open them. Grace just stood there in the doorway, soaking it all up. This was what she would leave behind. Not just her boys, but the grandkids they were bringing up. The lessons about love and staying true and having faith that would carry on long after they were gone. This was the life she and Owen had made from scratch. Owen came up and stood right beside her, wrapping his arms around her middle. "Quite a bunch we have got here, huh?" "The best bunch a person could ever ask for," Grace agreed. Emma, Oliver's daughter, saw them standing there, and she smiled. At 16, she was growing into a fine young woman with her father's quiet and kind ways. "You two are always standing just like that," she said. "Papa says you have been doing it since the day you were married." "Well, it is a mighty fine place to stand," Owen told her. pulling Grace in just a little bit tighter. Right next to the person you love more than anything. "Grandpa, tell us the story," Emma asked. "The one about how you and Grandma met." It was a question they had heard 100 times from the grandkids, but Grace never got tired of answering it. She and Owen would take turns telling the tale, painting a picture of that snowy day she first set foot in Hecla, scared and all alone. Owen had been waiting. "I had been waiting in the cold for you," Owen quoted his own words again, just as he always did whenever he told the story. "And when I saw her step down from that stagecoach, I knew my waiting was finally over." "Even though you did not even know her?" Emma asked, always captivated by the romance of it all. "Especially because I did not know her," Owen said with a smile. "I took a leap of faith. We both did. And it turned out to be the best decision I ever made in my life." Grace reached over and squeezed his hand. "Mine, too." The day unfolded in the warm, happy chaos of family. They had a huge breakfast, and presents were exchanged with lots of laughter and happy exclamations. Oscar's boys raced around the house with their new toys, while Emma sat reading quietly in a corner from her new book. Grace cooked the big Christmas dinner with help from her daughters-in-law, women she had come to love as if they were her own daughters. As evening began to fall and the whole family gathered around the big table, Owen stood up to say grace. But just before he started the blessing, his eyes scanned the faces of all his kinfolk, and they finally settled on Grace. He said, "I have a lot to be thankful for. I am thankful for this meal, for this house, and for my boys and their own families. But the thing I am most grateful for is my wife, Grace." He went on, 45 years back, she took a real gamble and traveled to this untamed land to marry a man she had never met. She had about 100 chances to go back home. She could have been sorry she ever made that choice, but she did not leave. She stayed right here and made this life with me. Every single good thing I have comes from that one courageous choice she made. Grace could feel warm tears running down her face. Owen kept talking. "She showed me that a broken heart can mend, and that love can grow from even the simplest of beginnings. She proved that the finest things you will ever find are usually in places you never thought to look. So, Grace, with our whole family watching, I need to thank you. Thank you for making that journey to Hecla in the middle of a blizzard, for agreeing to be my wife, for giving me your love, and for giving me this family, this whole life, and all this happiness. You are the finest gift God has ever given me." Well, there was not a single person at that table whose eyes were dry when Owen said his piece. Grace got up from her chair and walked right to him. He pulled her into a big hug as their family watched them. "I love you," Grace whispered, her face against his shirt. "I will love you until I breathe my last, and even after that." And Owen answered, "I love you too. You were the bride who came to me in a letter, and you became the whole love of my life." They all shared their meal then, the big family that Grace and Owen had made, and the room was full of comfort and happy noise and affection. Outside, the snow started coming down again, quiet and sure, covering all of Hecla in a blanket of white. But in that house, there was nothing but a warm glow and the sure-as-anything feeling that they were all right where they were meant to be. Later on, as the night started to settle and folks were getting ready for sleep, Grace walked out onto the front porch. The snow was coming down thicker then, and it reminded her of the very first night she came to that town. She heard the screen door creak open, and then she felt Owen's warm coat drape across her shoulders. "You are going to catch your death out here," he scolded her softly, putting his arms around her from the back. "I just wanted to watch the snow fall," Grace told him. "It makes me think of my first night here." "Yes," he said. "I was scared to death, Owen. I did not know a thing about the kind of man you were, or what sort of life was waiting for me. All I knew for sure was that I could not go back to where I came from." Owen then asked, "And what about now?" Grace shifted in his embrace so she could look him in the eye. "Now, I could not dream of a different life. This place is my home. You are my home. Everything I could ever want or ever need is right here in this spot." Owen held her face between his hands and gave her a kiss that was slow and gentle and carried all the weight of the years they had known. When they finally broke apart, they were both grinning. "You had better come on in before you turn into an icicle," Grace said, teasing him with his own words. "I have known my share of cold winters," Owen replied, a little sparkle in his eye. "But having you next to me, I have never been warmer." The two of them went back into the house, shutting the door tight against the snowy evening. The home was still and quiet, with the rest of the family sound asleep. Grace and Owen went about their nightly habits, moving with a comfort that only comes from years of practice. They knew just where the other would step and what the other would need without a word. Later in bed, tangled up together under the heavy quilts that Grace's own grandmother had stitched, they spoke in low voices. They talked about the day that had passed, about their family, and what they might do the next day. It was simple and it was flawless. It was exactly the life they had made side by side for 45 years. "Grace," Owen said, his voice soft as they were about to fall asleep. "Yes?" "I just wanted to thank you for finding your way to me through that blizzard. Thank you for not leaving. Thank you for giving me your love." Grace grinned there in the dark room. "And thank you for standing out in the freezing cold for me. Thank you for having patience. Thank you for showing me what love was truly about." They finally drifted off to sleep, still in each other's arms. They were just two people who had bet everything on a chance and ended up with more than they ever thought to wish for. The time that came after was filled with more good times and a little bit of sadness, too. They had to say goodbye to old friends who passed on from age or sickness. They got to watch their grandkids get bigger and start their own families. They saw Hecla itself change and get bigger. It became a more modern town, but somehow held on to its true spirit. And through every bit of it, Grace and Owen were the one sure thing for each other. They got a little more fragile as the years went by, needing a bit more help and not moving quite as fast. But the love they had for each other never faded. If anything, it got even stronger, like it was boiled down to the very heart of it. One morning in the springtime, after 62 years of being married, Grace opened her eyes and saw Owen just looking at her. He had a look of such sweet love on his face it nearly made her forget to breathe. "What is on your mind?" she asked him. "I was just laying here thinking about how beautiful you are," Owen told her, "and how fortunate I am." Grace let out a laugh. It was a sound that was still like a melody, even at 86 years of age. "I am an old woman, all wrinkled and with gray hair." "You are flawless," Owen said, not backing down. "Just as flawless as you were on the day you got down from that stagecoach." "You are an awful fibber," Grace said with a warm smile. "But I love you for it anyway." "I am not fibbing," Owen argued. "Grace, you have been beautiful every single day for the 62 years that I have had you in my life. Your beauty is not about being young or having skin without lines. It is in your good heart, in your deep-down strength, and in how much love you can give. That kind of beauty has done nothing but get bigger over all this time." Grace felt her eyes well up with tears. Even after all these years, Owen's words could still make her cry. "What on earth did I ever do to earn a man like you?" "You climbed onto a stagecoach and put your trust in a man you did not know," Owen said. "You took a big chance, a real leap of faith, and I will thank my lucky stars for that leap for the rest of my days." They passed that morning the same way they passed most of their mornings by then. They sat side by side on their porch and watched the day begin all around them. Hecla was a whole different place from the little mining camp Grace had first seen so many years before. The town was bigger now, doing much better, with nicer roads and all the new comforts, but the mountains had not changed. They still stood tall and grand off to the west, and the sky above still seemed to go on forever. "You do not have any regrets, do you?" Owen asked, just like he had asked so many times before. "Not one single one," Grace answered, just like she always did. My only regret is that we did not get even more time, Owen said. But I suppose that is just being selfish. We have had a better run than most folks could ever hope for. Grace rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the sure, steady rhythm of his heart. She knew they had been blessed, not just with how many years they got, but with how good those years were. They had made something special and valuable, something that would ripple down through their children and their children's children for a long, long time. 3 months after that morning, Owen passed on quietly in his sleep. Grace grieved for him with all her heart, but she felt more thankfulness than she did sorrow. They had been given 62 years with each other. Those years were packed with love and good humor and meaning. There are not a lot of people who can say that. At his funeral, which felt like half the state of Montana showed up for, Oliver talked about how his father was committed to doing right and to his family. Oscar talked about their father's powerful character and his kind ways. But it was their granddaughter, Emma, who was now all grown up with a husband and kids of her own, who really said what Grace and Owen's love meant to everyone. My grandma and grandpa, they showed all of us what real love is supposed to look like, she said, her voice trembling just a little. They began as two people who had never met, just brought together by chance. But every morning they woke up, they made a choice to love one another, to stand by each other, and to make a beautiful life together. They showed us that love is not just some feeling you get. It is a choice you make. It is something you do, a promise you keep making over and over every day. Grandpa stood waiting in the freezing cold for Grandma, and she traveled all that way to him through a blizzard. And from that start, which nobody would have bet on, they made a love story that will be told forever. Grace sat right there in the first pew, with her sons and grandkids and great-grandkids all around her. She could feel that Owen was there with her, just as plain as if he was in the seat next to her. He was no longer with them, but everything they had made together was still there. It was alive in their family, in the beliefs they had passed down, and in the example of love they had set. Once the service was over, as folks were heading out, young Emma came over and sat down next to Grace. "Grandma, are you doing okay?" Grace managed a smile, even with the tears in her eyes. "I am heartbroken, darling. I am going to miss your grandpa more than words can say. But I am also so thankful. We had a special kind of love, the kind not everybody finds. And now I have all of you, his legacy and mine." "Tell me the story one more time," Emma asked. "The one about the blizzard." And so Grace told that story again. It was the one she had told more times than she could count. It was about the scared young girl who journeyed 2,000 miles to become the wife of a man she had never laid eyes on. It was about the man who stood in the freezing cold waiting for her, full of patience and kindness. And it was about how the two of them took a giant leap of faith and created a love that endured for a whole life. "I have been waiting in the cold for you," Grace said, repeating Owen's words. Even after all this time, they made her heart hurt in a sweet way. He just said it like it was a fact, but it turned into something so much bigger. He was there waiting for me, and I went to him, and the two of us found everything we were ever looking for. Emma gave her grandmother a big, tight hug. "That is the prettiest love story I think I will ever hear." It was a pretty story, Grace agreed. And it was true. That is the part that made it so special. Grace went on living for another 3 years after Owen was gone. She stayed clear-headed and involved in everything right up to her last day. She filled those last years with her family, telling them the old stories, sharing what she had learned, and loving them with all her might. When her time finally came, she passed on quietly at 89 years old, with Owen's name on her breath and a peaceful smile on her face. They laid her to rest beside Owen in the Hecla Cemetery, right under the shadow of a big pine tree that looked out at the mountains they both had cherished. The stone marker they put up had just a few words on it. Owen Ellis and Grace Ellis. He waited for her in the cold. She walked to him through the storm, and together they finally made it home. Afterwards, the whole family came together at the old house, the one Owen had put up with his own hands, and Grace had filled with love. Oliver stood on the porch where his parents had spent so many evenings together, just looking out at the mountains. "They had something special, did they not?" Oscar said, coming to stand right there beside his brother. "They sure did," Oliver agreed. "Against all odds, they found a real love. They showed all of us what was possible." "I just hope I can build something half as good with my wife," Oscar said quietly. "We all do," Oliver replied. "That is their legacy, is it not? Not just showing us what love can be, but inspiring us to go out and find it ourselves, to take care of it, and to make it last." The family stayed together all through the evening, sharing stories about Grace and Owen, laughing and crying. They were celebrating two lives that were lived so well, and a love that had risen from humble beginnings to become something truly extraordinary. As night fell and the stars began to pop out in the vast Montana sky, Emma stood on the same porch where her grandparents had stood so many times. She thought about Grace arriving in a snowstorm, scared and desperate. She thought about Owen, waiting in the cold, feeling all alone and not knowing what would come next. She thought about how both of them had taken that great big leap of faith, and from it, they built something truly beautiful. It was a story worth holding on to, a story worth telling, and a story worth living up to. It was a story about courage, hope, and a love that lasted. It was a story that proved sometimes the very best things in your life show up in the most unexpected ways. It showed that love can surely blossom in the middle of the coldest winter. And that faith, when you pair it with dedication and real care, can bring about miracles. The wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the smell of snow from far away. Emma smiled, feeling the presence of her grandparents there in the quiet evening. They were together again. She was sure of it. Together no matter where they were, just as they had been for 62 years on this earth. And somewhere in the growing twilight, if you listened close enough, you might just hear the echo of Owen's voice. "I have been waiting in the cold for you." And then you would hear Grace's reply, "And I came all the way through the storm to find you." Theirs was a love story for the ages. It was born in a snowstorm, raised on faith, and it would last for all eternity. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.